Hey there, everyone. We are going to be going through some of the highlights from chapters 11 and 12 today. So we're going to be looking at some physical, cognitive, and social changes that happen in adolescence. So let's go ahead and start off first off with our brain changes here. So one of the primary things that's developing in adolescence is the prefrontal cortex. And as we have mentioned before, this area is very important when it comes to executive processing. And what we mean by that is things like planning out your actions ahead of time, making good decisions, critical thinking, right? So if you are familiar with adolescents, you might think, boy, that's a bunch of impulsive people that don't think very much before they act. And the reason for that is that this part is still developing. So their bodies have developed a lot faster as a whole than the brain has. So the brain isn't going to reach full maturity for another several years for the adolescent. So this is a really important time, crucial time for brain development. So as that happens, as their brain does get more fully developed, as the prefrontal cortex develops, they'll be able to hopefully be making better decisions, which is important for all of us who are on the roads and driving vehicles and maybe encountering some of these adolescents as they start to get their driver's licenses. So most adolescents will have a brain growth spurt around age 17 or so that continues for several years into the early and mid 20s. And most brains are considered approximately fully developed around age 25 or so. All right. There are also some other physical changes that are happening. Girls tend to achieve their maximum height by around age 16 or so, whereas boys do continue to grow for a few more years up to around age 20. So if you are a 20-year-old male, unfortunately, you're probably at your peak height. So if you didn't quite make 6 foot like me, stuck at 5'11", tough luck. That's where you're going to be the rest of your life. Actually, check that. You'll probably shrink a little in several years, but that's about as far as you're going to go. Another thing that we notice is that there are some gender differences in terms of strength. So girls typically develop physically a little bit faster than boys. So you may have noticed, say, in elementary school or junior high, that there was often a girl that was the tallest person in your class. So this is often no longer the case in adolescence because the boys tend to catch up physically. And then in terms of strength, by age 17, boys can be as much as 3 times as strong as girls. So boys tend to have about 40% total body mass as muscle, and girls only have about 24%. And girls are also experiencing a rise in fat on the body, which is just natural. And this is part of what allows for puberty to take place for women. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just know that that is actually important for female development. So in terms of what's happening here in adolescence, of course, we have puberty happening. So several things are going on inside the body at any particular time. So we've got the pituitary gland that's signaling the adrenal gland to produce androgens, which then stimulate growth. These pituitary hormones stimulate growth of the ovaries and the testes. And so they do that through these particular hormones called testosterone and estradiol. So testosterone for the boys, developing their testes, estradiol for the ladies, producing their ovaries, making those develop more fully. And then other growth hormones are produced so the entire body grows. You've got human growth hormone. And so this cycle here is happening for several years as those areas of the body develop. So one thing that you'll want to take a look at here for the ladies and for the gentlemen are these different hormones here and the specific areas of growth that they tend to produce. So go ahead and take a look through that. I'm going to move on, but you guys, I'd encourage you to take a look at that and spend a little time getting familiarized with that. It may be helpful for you later on. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Other physical changes here, we see what's called a secular trend for the girls as they reach menarche or their first period, their first menstruation. this has been happening a little bit earlier, about 4 months per decade earlier for ladies, and there are some changes in diet and lifestyle that have been thought to lead to this. But typically, this first period that girls are going to experience is going to happen about 2 years after the beginning of some other visible signs of puberty. So, like getting pubic hair, for instance. Let's see here. For the boys, we see that they can reach sexual maturity around age 13 or so. So that's about the time that they're able to have their first orgasm, their first ejaculation with orgasm. And so that would be when they've been considered to reach sexual maturity. For ladies, this would be when their ovaries are developed and they release their first egg or ovum. We start to see several other changes for the boys here, several changes for the girls here. And what's interesting here, actually, if I switch back to the boys here real quick. So we see some of these visible changes and audible changes that happen for the boys. There are some actual social changes that can happen as a result of when these changes happen. So if boys are early or late bloomers, if you've heard of a late bloomer or an early bloomer, these are boys who reach their physical changes from puberty a little bit sooner, a little bit later. And so this can actually be associated with depression for boys, and you can imagine why. They don't fit in. So if their voice has dropped to kind of more of a baritone or a bass tone, as you can hear it in my voice. I don't have my high-pitched voice that I did when I was in junior high. So when that happens, if you're the only one who's got this deep baritone or bass tone to your voice, then you're not going to fit in with your peers. And so this can lead to depression for boys. But interestingly, these early changes can also be associated with being a leader for boys. So it could be good, could be bad. And of course, it's never just one factor. There are going to be some other things to consider. For the ladies, if we have these early or late changes here, we can experience some of that same change in the sense that social change, in the sense that it can be good or bad for them. So especially for early developing girls, this often is associated with a negative body image. So as much as we might hear in popular culture that for women to, say, develop breasts, that's typically seen as a positive thing socially. Our culture really values that aspect of the woman's body. If we just look at any kind of advertising or TV, if you are a girl who's developing that early and far ahead of your peers, you're going to stand out, you're going to look different, and you may get made fun of. So early developing girls may have more of a negative body image because they don't fit in. And for the girls, fitting in is very important, just like for the boys, but girls tend to compare themselves a little bit more to their peers than boys do. Boys tend to have a little bit more of an internal ideal. As far as sexual behavior and physical changes, so we talked about when puberty hits, that's essentially getting sexual maturity and the ability to have children and engage fully in sexual activity. Early sexuality tends to be associated with several social factors, such as being impoverished, not having adult supervision, using alcohol. So again, one of these is not necessarily causing the other, but these are correlations. And again, also children who have been abused or neglected are more likely to engage in sexual activity earlier. In fact, that's one of the things that we might look for in a school setting, is if you are a teacher, or maybe even if you're a therapist, you may be, heck, even a youth pastor, right? So you might see these signs of hypersexuality in children. And one of the things we want to think about is, has this child experienced some kind of abuse, some kind of neglect, especially sexual abuse? So just some different signs to be looking for here. In terms of sexual activity among high school students, we see that the numbers are a little bit different for males and females early on. When we get to 9th grade here, more boys have either had sex or had multiple partners. But then when we get to 12th grade, the numbers get pretty close together here. So a majority of teenagers in 12th grade will report that they've had sex at least one time. So that's over 60% for males and females here. So the ladies tend to catch up with the men in that sense. All right, let's talk about moral beliefs and how these can influence sexual behavior. So there are some correlates of things that will reduce sexual activity, lower sexual activity in teens. And these tend to be those who believe that premarital sex is wrong, those who attend religious services, and we can see where maybe these two things might correlate here, those who participate in school activities. So if you have children or are planning on having children someday and they become teenagers and reach sexual maturity and you are concerned about that, get them involved, right? So they're going to meet more people, but the idea here is they're keeping busy and they're engaging typically with same-sex peers, which for the majority of adolescents is going to mean not the people that they are sexually attracted to. So keep them involved in school activities. Don't encourage alcohol use. Don't support that. Even if it makes you the cool parent, it's going to make it more likely that they will engage in sexual activity. I can still remember one of the moms on my high school football team who would host parties for the football team. I did not go to these parties, but I remember very specifically hearing that she would buy alcohol for the students, which is not only illegal, but just a bad idea. So it also encouraged additional sexual behavior, as we can see by that slide. So things to consider there. We're not going to spend time on this, but definitely familiarize yourself with the crisis intervention model here for pregnant teenagers. So they're going from a stage of confusion here through hopefully redefining their situation or themselves in the situation. And those who don't, going to end up in a dysfunctional phase where they're essentially stuck and they've failed to reconceptualize their life in light of this pregnancy. All right, so we're going to spend a few slides here talking about adolescent sexuality in terms of sexual minority youth, because this is not only a growing population in terms of those who are quote unquote out, but also just culturally it's an important issue for us to be aware of. The Kinsey scale, this scale doesn't determine whether someone is gay or straight, but speaks to the degree to which they exhibit behaviors that are consistent with being heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual. So it's a scale from 0 to 6. The 0 indicates very strong exclusive heterosexual behavior, and a 6 being exclusive homosexual behavior. An important category here of teens to think about, even though they represent a very small percentage of the population, it's certainly something that impacts any kind of service provider for children and teens. And if you're thinking teenagers, if you're thinking any kind of youth worker, YMCA, or your teachers, your pastors, your therapists. So transgender teens are at one of the highest risks for suicide of any other group of teenagers. So these teens, if we're thinking about Erikson and the idea of trying to develop a solid identity, we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. These teens are at very high risk because they're having a very hard time with their identity. And it may not be that they are confused about their identity, but it may be that they don't feel that they will be accepted for their identity. But a transgendered teen is essentially a teenager who has the internal experience of being the gender that is not associated with their assigned sex at birth. So if physiologically, if your genotype and phenotype are that you are male, you're XY, and your external genitalia includes a penis and testes, then you are considered male gender-wise. And so that may be inconsistent with your internal felt sense of who you are, and so then you may identify as female or even somewhere else on what's now considered the gender spectrum, where it's you may consider yourself non-binary, not male, not female, but somewhere in between. So these are transgendered teens, and so one kind of a subset of this would be transsexuals who not only experience themselves as being in the wrong body, being the opposite gender of what they've been assigned, but who take the ultimate step of having some kind of gender reassignment surgery, maybe using sex hormones to change the physical appearance of their body to more accurately reflect what gender they identify with. So this goes beyond just getting a different haircut and changing your clothes so that you can pass as the other gender, but actually changing your physical body to match what you feel that you are. Other sexual minority youth, these are a little more common than transgendered teens, but still in the minority. This realization of being gay or bisexual often happens in middle school, sometimes earlier, depending on whom you talk to. But it's such an abnormal thing, an unusual statistical phenomenon in the population. So less than 10% of the population is gay or bisexual in adulthood. And so the models that children see are not typically of gay individuals. It's watch just about any movie that's out there or TV show, and most of the relationships we see are straight, are heterosexual. So very few of them will accept their homosexuality during their adolescence. And another part of that may be their religious upbringing, so their value systems. I was in a webinar training last week, and one of the presenters had attended a non-affirming faith-based university in graduate school, and at that point he had not accepted his homosexuality. He was fighting against it. He had seen it as a sinful behavior to even just be homosexual, let alone the behavior. And so he chose attending a non-affirming faith-based institution to help him to avoid the temptation of being gay. And at some point during his graduate training, he accepted himself, he accepted his sexual preference, and now is openly gay. But that was a process that he went through, and he had started graduate school in late adolescence, so in his early 20s. And so now he's resolved that for himself and is just openly gay. But that's pretty common for gay adolescents to not accept themselves and their sexuality during their adolescence for whatever reason. There's a lot of debate about what the cause of homosexuality is, either at a biological or sociological level. Environment seems to play a role, but there seems to be a very strong biological component, a very long genetic component. This we see through twin studies. So if you have one identical twin who is gay, you're very likely to see the other. So there's a high concordance rate for identical twins. And then prenatal sex hormones may also play a role. So if the mother has a higher, a higher release of sex hormones during that time, that may play a role. We talked about transgender teens and defined that already, and I just wanted to reiterate again the higher rates of depression and suicide. So if you work with a teen who is transgendered, make sure that they have support. One thing that my pastor said, and forgive me if I've mentioned this before, but one thing that my pastor consistently says is that even if we disagree with someone about something, if we think what they're doing is wrong, first off, if someone is not a Christian, it is not our job to hold them to Christian standards. They're not a Christian. They didn't sign up for that. Our job is to help them become a Christian, and then to help them change their ways if that's appropriate. So when talking to people who disagree with us, who have a different way of being in the world than we are, he would always say, don't lose love for the sake of being right. So always make sure that anything and everything you do, approach people with love, and don't lose the love and compassion you have for people for the sake of being right. So even if you are right, according to scriptures, don't lose the love component when you're talking to people. And I think that's really important, especially when we look at these high rates of depression and suicide, because it's not only that people are being, that transgender teens in particular are being rejected, but they're being rejected in a very hateful way, with a lot of bullying, with just really degrading language. So it's really sad, and I mean, the abuse even ends up with death sometimes. It leads to death sometimes for these teens. So let's not lose the love whenever we disagree with someone. And that's just not for transgender teens, but for anybody that may disagree with our faith. All right, we've talked about that. So sensation seeking in adolescence, another important topic to cover here because we see it all over the place. And part of this is because the way that the brain is being rewired. So there's a lot of rewiring going on during adolescence, and especially that prefrontal cortex being developed. So really important that we teach teens, that we monitor them, that we teach them self-control strategies, impulse control strategies, that we model for them appropriate behaviors. So if all they're seeing is risky behavior on television, not only is their brain primed for it, but socially they're primed to engage in risky behavior. So really important that we model appropriately for teenagers here. One way that this can manifest itself, this risky behavior, is through drug, alcohol, and tobacco use. So fortunately, use is down for each of these, but it's still a big problem, especially alcohol use. And so this sensation seeking, those who have a higher degree of risk-taking behavior, of sensation seeking, those who enjoy that more, are more likely to engage in drug and alcohol use. And a couple final thoughts here. We'll look at depression and suicide, and then formal operations, a different kind of thought here for chapter 11 here. So depression and suicide, 5% of teenagers experience depression, and then up to 15% of teens have considered committing suicide. So a lot of those, that 15% will be those who've experienced depression, but they are related but not mutually exclusive, and not necessarily one causing the other. So you don't have to have depression to think about suicide. You could be highly anxious and be considering suicide. You could just be in a really difficult family situation and see that that's the best way out. So a high incidence rate, causes and contributing factors, these tend to, as we've said, contribute to one another, but it's not a direct causal relationship. So some other factors outside of this could be a genetic basis, so we can be prone to depression genetically. It could be that there are some hormonal issues, hypothyroidism. So there are some genetic components. There are other biological components like hormones, your neurotransmitters, say your serotonin levels or dopamine levels could be low. So you could have some biological components here, but there are also many sociological factors as well. So we might have bullying, not fitting in, earlier development, earlier puberty. So a lot of things can happen here. And of course, the consequences here, with depression, children may withdraw from school, engage in isolating behavior, and that then can lead to increased thoughts about suicide. I don't fit in. I never will. It's not worth being here anymore. Things aren't ever going to get better. So some really sad negative consequences here from a social perspective, but also even from an academic perspective, grades do tend to decrease for both of these. Which you can imagine, if you're staying homesick with depression, you're going to miss out on school, and you're not going to be able to concentrate when you're doing an exam. So a lot of possible consequences there. And then final thing from chapter 11 here, there are definitely some changes that happen in Piaget's theory here, Piaget's theory of cognitive development. The final stage is formal operational thought. And so this is the ability to reason logically about abstract concepts, so things that we can't necessarily see. So this is where we might get more into philosophy. So think about a question we might ask about God and what that might look like. So God is not some person that we can see or that we can touch, not directly anyway. So I've got a couple of young boys, and the oldest is 4, and he asks some interesting questions about God. So where does God live? He might ask something like that. Does God love us? Okay, so I can answer those questions. I can say, well, God lives in heaven. Well, where is heaven? Okay, well, I often ask him, do you want the small answer or the big answer? And the small answer is, well, it's in the sky, right? And the big answer is, well, it's actually outside of space and time, and it's not in the same dimensions, and then we have to explain dimensions. So he's asking pretty concrete questions. Where does God live? He's thinking, on what street does God live? Just like his grandparents. But when we reach formal operational thinking and get out of that concrete stage where we don't actually have to be able to touch and manipulate something to think about it, we can have very different thoughts about God. And we can ask questions like, if God loves us, why did he wait for thousands of years of human history to send Jesus? Why not start with Jesus so that all of the thousands of years of people before Jesus don't burn in hell? Right? Why we can ask that kind of question that's very philosophical and theological. And by the way, a couple answers to that, maybe people weren't ready for Jesus. Maybe we needed to experience the law, and we needed to experience our own frailty and failure and our need for Jesus before God could send him, and before we would take Jesus seriously. But we could also say, well, if we look at human history, Jesus came into the world at a time when civilization had reached a critical point where there was written communication in addition to oral tradition. And, a big thing you learn about in your history class, your world civ class, is the Roman roads. So there was travel by sea and by land by which people could carry the gospel message to the world, right? So if the Great Commission is to take the gospel to the world, Jesus came at a time when, really for the first time ever, that was actually possible in a reasonable kind of time frame. And I mean, how much more so today with the internet and easy air travel through helicopter and personal planes and jumbo jets. I mean, we can take the gospel to everybody. I heard one scholar say that we could fulfill the Great Commission in the next decade if we as Christians really took advantage of that. So I'm going to hop off the pulpit here, but that's all possible because we've reached formal operations. Okay, so we're able to think about things differently. Now, with adolescent egocentrism, we don't always do that. So sometimes through adolescent egocentrism, we think my thoughts and my feelings and beliefs are unique, which is not a very enlightened thought. We also sometimes exist in what we call a personal fable, where essentially my life is controlled by what I think about my life. So if I say, oh, I'm never going to get anybody pregnant, I can have sex as much as I want, without protection, because I don't see myself as being the kind of guy that would get somebody pregnant. That's just not going to happen. Or I totally see myself going to college, so I don't need to study. It'll just happen, right? So maybe we don't live our lives in a wise way. So just remember, just because you're capable potentially of reasoning logically about abstract concepts doesn't mean that you're actually doing that all the time. All right, let's move ahead and think about some issues in chapter 12 here. So we'll be looking at social and personality development, hitting some of the highlights here again. So we mentioned Erikson a few minutes ago and his identity versus role confusion stage. So really the primary task of this, and this happens for most people during adolescence, the primary task here is to figure out, who the heck am I in the world? So achieving a personal identity, which this came up when we were talking about transgendered teens who are having a hard time with this identity, right? So what is my identity? Who am I in the world? And how do I relate to other people? So hopefully, if we've successfully resolved this stage, our sense of self becomes integrated and we identify with our peer groups. So we are able to feel like I fit in with somebody, not with everybody, because that's not possible. As much as Paul says, I become all things to all men that I might win some for Christ, he didn't actually fit in with everybody. There were some people that persecuted him, but he tried to be flexible in his identity so that he could relate to other people. So a good example to follow there. All right, so the more we talk about identity here, we're going to see some other theories about identity development. And Marcia had an interesting theory about this that involves several stages, and each stage has two key components. Here we have a crisis, which is a period of decision making where we have to consider, what are my values? What is important to me? And then this stage of commitment is where we go ahead and say, I've looked at my goals and my values, and I've selected these as being the most important, and I'm going to do something about it. So this is my belief system or my ideology, and I've made a commitment to pursuing that. So we've got several stages here: identity achievement, moratorium, foreclosure, and identity diffusion and identity achievement. Both the crisis and commitment have been processed. So I've examined my own values and beliefs, and I have made a commitment to follow them in some particular way. In moratorium, currently experiencing a crisis, and you're working through that, but you haven't made a commitment yet. In foreclosure, you've made a commitment, but without really examining your values. So maybe you've made a commitment because of something that your parents told you. Maybe it's just something that your family does. Or, maybe you've gone to college and haven't picked a major because you figure, well, everybody's supposed to go to college, right? Isn't that how this works? So maybe you go to college but haven't picked a major. And then with identity diffusion, you've examined neither, and you've not examine the crisis, you've not gone through your own values, and you've not made a commitment either. So some examples here. If we've got commitment and we've explored the crisis, then we have identity achievement. So something like, I want to help people and I'm good at science, so I decided to be a nurse, right? So that person has examined their values. I like helping people. And what am I good at? So looking at my skills, and have made a commitment to a particular career path, like being a nurse. So I'll let you take a look at these yourself, but these are some other examples of these different identity statuses. An interesting thing for kids as they're developing here through those preteen through late teenage years, the way that people think about themselves changes quite a bit. The way they express themselves changes during these years. So for my 4-year-old, when I say, Jack, tell me about yourself. And so he'll say, well, I'm a boy and I'm really fast. I'm good at stacking blocks, or I know all my colors, or something, right? So he'll say some things about himself, especially about his physical characteristics, or maybe some things that he can do, but very little about I'm a Christian, right? This is a very developing piece of his identity. He's probably not going to say, I am a son. He's going to say, I'm a boy, but he's not going to say, I'm a son. So that's not a way that he thinks about himself abstractly and in relationship to other people. So the older he gets, as he reaches later adolescence and adulthood, he's going to describe himself a lot less in terms of his physical characteristics. He's not going to walk into the room and say, I'm 5'10" and 160 pounds, and he's not going to go with his height and weight there. Right? He's going to say, I'm a student, or I'm interested in dating this person. So it's going to be maybe more relational. It's going to be about other people. It's going to be perhaps a certain belief set that he has, or a concept he wants to study. So very different way of expressing ourselves here. We've also got some interesting differences in terms of self-concept for boys and for girls. And I believe we talked about this before, where the girls tend to think about themselves more in comparison with other people. So what people think about them is pretty important to them. They're going to modify their appearance, their behavior, the way they talk, more so than a boy might. And again, remember, we're talking averages, not about any particular person. So if this doesn't fit you and your group of friends, don't worry about it. But on the whole, on average, girls are influenced more by internal and external comparisons, versus boys being more self-defined, internally defined. So looking at their own internal ideals. So girls maybe use more of a peer performance standard. All right. Self-concept, self-esteem. Self-concept is how do I think about myself, and maybe what's my identity. Self-esteem is how do I feel about myself. So this is a sense of global self-worth. Am I worthy? Am I okay? Am I good enough? So in terms of self-esteem, this is correlated with positive outcomes, doing better in school, not caving into peer pressure. So if you have low self-esteem, you may be more likely to cave into peer pressure to feel a little better about yourself, even though you might not agree with what your peers are doing. And boys are more likely than girls to have continuous high self-esteem or rising self-esteem throughout adolescence. So girls just are at higher risk for having self-esteem concerns in adolescence. All right, in terms of gender role, we've talked about this one a little bit in chapter 11 here, but gender role is related to aspects of the psychological self. So this is not your gender identity necessarily all by itself, but your gender role has to do also with your behavior. So not just your felt sense of self, but your behavior. So these are obviously some social conventions. These are things that are pushed on us by society and by the media, by all of our various social influences. But what we've seen in recent decades is that gender role and gender identity have tended to be more flexible. So some reasons for this may be kind of a post-feminism world that we're living in now, where, and not that it's post-feminism, I know, but after the first, second, and now in the middle of the third wave of feminism here, women's roles in society, at least in Western culture, have changed quite a bit. We have a lot more women in the workplace. We have more men who are choosing to stay home and be with their children more. So gender roles are much more fluid or flexible, and we may have men and women who are doing very overlapping tasks. So being masculine and feminine, these are not polar opposites anymore. These are overlapping concepts. So it's difficult and maybe even in some ways easier for teenagers to assert their own identity. Easier maybe in the sense that it's more acceptable to not just be one type of identity, but more difficult in that there's still some pushback from society and from cliques of children to be a certain way. All right, ethnic identity. There are multiple models of ethnic identity. Finney's 3 stages here are unexamined, searching, and then a clear ethnic identity. So in terms of the unexamined, these have negative images and stereotypes that are common in the wider culture, and they tend to see themselves maybe the way that the majority culture does. And so then this ethnic identity search tends to happen. This is where they're actually starting to self-identify as a member of a specific group and as a unique individual within that group. So getting away from this unexamined place where they just say, what does everybody else say about me? I guess I'm that thing, that stereotype. So then they start to do this ethnic identity search, and they maybe have had some kind of experience, maybe some kind of discrimination or a significant relationship that triggered them to think more deeply about themselves and their identity. And then through that process, a positive outcome would be having a clear ethnic identity that does not necessarily have to involve any particular level of identity with one ethnic group or another. But whatever their identity is after that, it comes as a result of having searched themselves and what some options are around their ethnic identity, and they've resolved any conflicts or contradictions that have come up for them around their ethnic identity. We're going to spend a couple slides here looking at Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning here. So he's got several stages: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional reasoning. And I would encourage you to take a look at your textbook on there. So some great examples. There's a great chart on page 305 that discusses these various stages. And really what you're getting at with these stages, that you're moving from basically stage 1 here, where the child is just concerned about, I'm doing this thing because, not necessarily because it's the right thing, but because I've been told I'll get punished or not punished for whatever the behavior. So I'm going to steal these cookies because I'm hungry. Oh, wait, no, I'll get in trouble for that. No, I'm not going to do that. Right? So that is stage one reasoning. I want something. I'm not going to do it because I'll get punished. And then as we move further along to post-conventional here, we're moving into a place where I might go ahead and take those cookies even though I know it's wrong, but because I've thought through a higher order concept, like it's the greater good here. Like my child is starving. There are these cookies here. I don't know whose they are. I'm going to take them even though I know they're not mine because my children are starving. And the greater good for me there, even though I know it's legally wrong and probably morally wrong, is that even if I get punished, my kids will be alive. So that's the greater good. So I'd encourage you to check out that chart and work through these stages of moral reasoning here that Kohlberg has put forth. So some thoughts and criticisms about Kohlberg's theory, which is probably the most well-known theory of moral development. It's kind of a narrow approach in the sense that it's very Western. So anybody from a non-Western culture, there's a higher likelihood that they won't fit into that. And the reason for that is that Kohlberg's stages rely very much on justice. So we kind of think about right and wrong, and there's a justice orientation to whether or not I engage in a particular type of behavior. So justice is certainly an important concept around the world, but it's going to vary in terms of the degree of importance in different countries. One of the primary criticizers of Kohlberg's theory is Gilligan, and so she came from a perspective of saying, okay, well, yes, justice is important, but maybe it's not everything. And what about compassion? What about caring? So whereas Kohlberg saw justice as being a primary motivator for moral reasoning, Carol Gilligan said, I believe that as much as there's justice in the world and there's a need for that, there's also a need to care for people. And so my moral reasoning may come out of caring. And so her finding was that women tended to morally reason through situations more from a caring perspective than a justice perspective, and that the opposite was true for men, who were going to be more reliant upon justice as a way to reason through things. And so even Gilligan's theory still has a North American bias. So research has indicated a North American bias. And what we mean by that is, again, that non-Western and especially non-North American countries and people groups are going to reason from different perspectives based on their cultural backgrounds. All right, so last couple concepts here, looking at delinquency. Delinquency is specifically adolescent behavior that violates the law. So this isn't talking back to your teachers. Talking back to a teacher is not delinquent. Saying no to your parents is not delinquent. Even coming home after your parents' curfew of 6 p.m. that's still before whatever the city curfew is, maybe 10 o'clock or something. Disobeying your parents, not delinquency, even though it's really frustrating for the parents, right? So we're talking about behavior that violates the law. And so we've also got conduct disorder to consider here. So there's a difference between oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. Oppositional defiant disorder is more what we just talked about with not listening to your parents, not following your teacher's directions, maybe breaking some rules, but not major law violations here. It's really more of an attitude problem than it is a law problem. So conduct disorder, this is more about violating the rights of others and breaking the law. So setting fires, stealing things. So adolescent onset conduct disorder is different from child onset in the sense that child onset is the scarier kind, where it's much less likely to have a positive outcome. So teens diagnosed with adolescent onset conduct disorder, we can say that there's a better chance that this is related to peer pressure and trying to set up their own identity, figure out who they are in their peer group. And so they may have developed moral reasoning, but had a lag in their behavior catching up with their ability to reason morally. So there's more hope for these kids that they'll be able to resolve that problem. So last couple of things to think about here are we're going to look at attachment here and romantic relationships. So For adolescents, they really have two primary and contradictory tasks here, and that's that they need to separate from their parents and yet still maintain attachment. So develop a separate individual identity, and then also separate from their parents, and while still staying attached to their parents. Excuse me. So parents still remain a safe base for them while they explore the world in new ways. So individual traits and factors do affect the degree and meaning of parenting conflict, but parenting conflict seems to be more of a stressor for the parents than for the teens, and it's really not the ever-present problem that culture makes it out to be. So a lot of teens do have very positive relationships with their parents, and the conflict is often around silly things like hairstyle, the amount of parent supervision that the child is getting. Not that that's a totally unreasonable concept to think about, but in the grand scheme of life, whether someone's doing heroin or not is very different from, are you going to be constantly in the room while my friends are over? So definitely a variety of issues that parents have to deal with. So strong attachment to parents, as we just mentioned, is important. It does matter. And so an adolescent's sense of well-being is strongly correlated more with quality of a parent attachment than with peer attachment. And so these strong attachments are associated with positive long-term outcomes, life outcomes. Some basic thoughts, or kind of broad summary thoughts of relationships with peers. Relationships with peers tend to be relatively stable, so there's not a lot of group hopping. You kind of find your peers and you stick with them for the most part through high school. And the way that they form these groups often is because there are shared values, shared behaviors or interests, and identity status. So, we can see this anytime we look out across the cafeteria and we see the groups of kids sitting around eating lunch together. They have some things in common. And so that is part of what leads to the stability in their relationships. So most of the time, the peer pressure that kids experience is going to be likely directed toward positive activities, not toward delinquent activities. So yes, parents, be concerned about your kids because their peer groups will be heavily influenced. They will heavily influence your kid, but rest a little bit easier in that as long as they're not in a highly delinquent group, there's a good chance that their peer pressure is going to be relatively positive. All right, the last final thought here, adolescent romantic relationships, and obviously there's a lot more you can read in your chapters about these various topics, but adolescent romantic relationships can start really right around the time that puberty develops. They can talk about being in love, and I can tell you a really important thing is to value that, take it seriously. If you want your kid to continue talking with you about their romantic interests, right? If you want to be in the know about what they're doing in their dating life, when they get a little bit older, make sure to value them, take them seriously, and just understand that their concept of being in love may be different from yours, but they still want to be attached to people, to their peers. Girls, there may be some gender differences here in that girls might derive more psychological intimacy from relationships earlier on than boys, but this pairing off is still meaningful to boys and girls. And a final thought here, we talked about early sexual activity. Early dating and early sexual activity is more common in lower income groups, regardless of racial group. So as we're working with teens, let's be mindful of this, and this is a risk factor, right? So we talk about risk factors. Low income is a risk factor for increased sexual activity, and especially in early dating. All right, guys, that's all for this week. Take care, and we'll see you next time.